Well, I spoke to the Trade Minister, Douglas Alexander, earlier. Let's listen to what he had to say. Thank you very much for being on the programme.
Pleasure.
So, big day today, trade deal with India. Just talk me through the details.
So we've been working on this trade deal since July when we were elected. It's been painstaking, patient and pragmatic work by the government. We're respectively the 5th and 6th largest economies in the world. India is the fastest growing economy in the G20, but has the highest tariffs in the G20. So it's a huge economic opportunity. We estimate about £4.8 billion a year in the long term to the UK economy.
Brexit benefit?
Well, truthfully, the Indians are talking to the Europeans at the moment. We managed to do this deal over the last few months. The biggest advocates of Brexit, as you remember, Boris Johnson and his predecessors didn't manage to get this deal done. They managed to do some of the easier parts of the deal, but we're delighted that we've managed to get it over the line.
OK, now, all trade deals come with compromises. And you said that you've been working on this for months. For us, it's just landed this afternoon. So we're trying to work out where those compromises are and the details, if you like, of the deal. So let me just try and get this straight. Indian workers don't have to pay national insurance. Indian companies don't have to pay national insurance in the UK. Is that correct?
So, first of all, in terms of the main compromises, because you're right to recognise that any trade deal involves compromises, largely took place in the space of tariffs, where, if you like, we've seen a reduction in our tariff levels, although they were lower than the Indian tariff levels to start with. We've seen very significant reduction on the Indians' part. So, of course, there's compromises.
But just you know, because as I say, I'm trying to get to grips with what this trade deal is all about. Is it correct that Indian workers don't have to pay national insurance in the UK and Indian companies don't have to pay national insurance in the UK?
Indian workers, if you define them as people who are employed by Indian companies through intercompany transfers coming in for a time-limited period, will be covered by this double contribution convention. We have already established social security arrangements in place with the European Union, with the United States and with others. And yes, the double contribution convention is part of this deal. So
just to be really clear, some Indian workers who meet those criteria won't have to pay national insurance in the UK?
No, because they will be employed by Indian companies and therefore are still obliged to pay social security payments within India.
Yes, so that's why I say in the UK. But they won't have to pay national insurance in the UK.
Right.
That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah.
And let's talk about Indian companies as well. And look, this is quite a big deal because there's an awful lot of British companies that are grappling with the rise in employers' national insurance that we've seen. Hospitality businesses, nurseries, all sorts. You know the arguments I do too. Indian companies don't have to pay that. Is that correct?
Well, Indian companies who are bringing people in for a temporary, time-limited period within the United Kingdom is not a permanent arrangement, it's for a time-limited period.
But that's correct. It's correct.
It's
they don't have to pay.
It's for a time-limited period, yeah.
I mean, do you think there's a fairness argument here?
I think that you have to see these trade deals in the round and
say... It's a compromise, though, isn't it? That's fair.
Well, any trade deal involves choices, and in that sense, we're very clear that the national interest is served by getting this deal done. And in that sense, a deal that's worth billions of pounds will ensure more money in British workers' pockets, higher wages, higher GDP, higher growth. That seems to me to be sensible.
Is it a pretty big incentive for these companies to employ Indian workers over British workers?
No, because these are Indian workers living and working in India who are only coming in for a temporary period. In that sense, it's not a permanent arrangement that will be put in place.
No, I understand it's not. But for those 3 years or whatever, you know, if you don't have to pay employers' national insurance, they don't have to pay employees' national insurance. You are going to employ them over British work, aren't you?
But if you see the arrangements the Indians have in place with other countries, if that was true, the Indians have arranged for 5 years with other countries. We negotiated down to a position of 3 years in terms of this double contribution convention. But in that sense, if you look at the commercial opportunities for Indian companies, or indeed for British companies working in India, we're convinced that actually it makes overall sense.
I'm not doing this in a loaded way. I'm just trying to get to the basics because it seems to me that it would be an incentive to employ those Indian workers for the reasons that I've just laid out.
There are lots of additional costs associated with bringing a worker who's based in India to come to work in the UK for a temporary period. Individual companies are going to make individual judgments. We're clear that overall it's in the UK's national interest both to grow the capacity of British businesses to sell into this huge and growing market, and at the same time to secure inward investment from India into the UK.
What you must have done an impact assessment on the number of Indian workers who may come to the UK through this scheme. What does it show?
Well, in terms of the visa arrangements, they remain completely unchanged by this arrangement. The points-based system
that's the answer to a
remains.
different question, though.
So if you just let me finish. The one point where you have seen an increase in the number of potential workers coming in terms of the arrangements that I think have been trumpeted by the Indian government this afternoon, is actually about a quota of 1,800, and it covers 3 categories of professions. It covers yoga instructors, classical music musicians and chefs. And in that sense, when the Indians were this afternoon celebrating the significant increase in those professions, it's capped at 1,800 and it's those 3 particular professions.
So only, but is that a specific thing though? Because surely, if Indian companies do decide to bring in more people, then that could increase the overall immigration numbers, no?
No, because they wouldn't be caught by the immigration numbers because they're temporary workers.
But so the increase in temporary workers then? So it won't be in the official numbers, but there could be an increase in temporary
Jonathan
workers.
Reynolds, the Secretary of State, only this afternoon has said this will not have an impact on the immigration numbers because they're not permanently locating to the UK. These are workers who often on intercompany transfers are coming in even for a very short period of time.
So what's the number on that then? What's the expected number for that?
Well, we'll publish, there will be, in terms of the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, there will be a document published later this afternoon. It may already be available on the .gov UK website. When I left the department to head to Parliament, it hadn't been put out there. Thereafter, there will be a lot more documentation that will be provided to Parliament, and Parliament will have the opportunity to scrutinise it.
What impact is it estimated to have on growth?
We're estimating that it will increase UK GDP by about £4.8 billion in the long term.
The impact assessment shows it will be a 0.1 increase in growth by 2040, which reflects the numbers you've just said. I guess my point is, trade deals are is a big achievement. Obviously, no one wants to say that. But at a time when people are worried about the taxes they pay, when they're worried about British businesses, when they're worried about immigration, it does feel like there are quite a lot of trade-offs here in order to get a boost of 0.1% in growth.
But if you look at how do we deal with the tax burden for the UK more generally, how do we fund the public services that we want? Our strength of public services is based on the strength of our economy. The UK is an open trading nation. As a population of
0.1 increase in growth by 2040. I mean,
yes, but
it's not.
But also, let's be honest. The Indian economy is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. The opportunities for UK businesses potentially will grow as the scale of the Indian economy grows. So, in that sense, if you were to say to me, which economies would you like to do a trade deal with? This is not a one and done. We're talking to the Indians. As you know, we're talking to the United States at the same time. We're also talking to the European Union in terms of resetting that relationship. Trade has a meaningful contribution to make to the government's central mission, which is growth.
We're talking an awful lot about growth because we know that growth makes things an awful lot easier for governments, right? It means you have to make less difficult choices on where you spend your money. I just want to finish the interview by talking about winter fuel. Because it felt to me that it came up again and again in the local elections. I had people from Reform saying to me that actually this is a bigger issue than all others, winter fuel. And it's one of those things where everyone knows about it and it's deeply unpopular at the same time. So is it right that you're not going to make any changes at all to the winter fuel allowance policy?
So you're right to recognise it's an issue that was raised on the doorsteps. I heard it in Runcorn, I heard it at the weekend in Hamilton. In Scotland, we're in a position where Anas Sarwar, the Scottish leader, has said that he will restore the winter fuel payment because in reality that's now a devolved benefit in Scotland. So there's a different approach being taken in different parts of the United Kingdom. I haven't been privy, honestly, to the conversations that have been happening in Westminster today. As you can imagine, with the Indian trade deal, that's been the main focus. But I think it's right to recognise that whether it's through the triple lock or the other measures that we're taking, we need to communicate effectively to people that while there is understandable disquiet and concern in relation to the winter fuel payment, there are other major steps that we're taking to support the pensioner population.
Keir Starmer says he's listening to the message last week. He says he gets it. And yet the government's saying today that they're not going to make any changes to winter fuel allowance. I mean, I just don't see how that can be true. You're either not listening or you don't get it on winter fuel.
Well, I think it's perfectly possible for a Prime Minister to listen, to reflect and to consider all of the different messages. The truth is I was
and then ignore it.
No, just let me finish the point. I was on dozens, if not hundreds of doorsteps, whether it was in Runcorn or whether it was in Hamilton over the weekend. Respectfully, you hear a lot of different points being made by the public, some good, some not so good. So in that sense, to say that you're listening is a recognition that there's a huge exercise in democracy underway. We had a very tough night. It's right to recognise that, both losing the by-election by such a tiny margin and also losing some very good councillors across the country. To recognise that and to say that we are listening, I don't think demands an immediate knee-jerk response from the Prime Minister the Monday after the polling day. I do think it's right to say, let's take time to reflect and to consider, and I think that's exactly what's happening.
So you're listening in the same way that, you know, when someone's telling you like a long story and you're kind of thinking about what you're going to have for dinner and what's going to be in your shopping list for the weekend. Is that the kind of listening you're doing?
No, I don't think that's a perfect analogy. I think it's to say, honestly, you hear a lot of different points on the doorstep. It's right to take time to consider them and at the same time weigh that up against what are the inherent challenges of government. If politics involved simply saying yes to everyone, it would be a whole lot easier than it is today.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.